Our guest this evening is Dr. Thomas Hazlett. He holds the H.H. Macaulay, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, Endowed Chair of Economics at Clemson University. He previously was chief economist of the Federal Communications Commission. His research interests are in law and economics with a specialization on the information economy, and he's published in a number of very prestigious economics and law journals, as well as provided expert testimony to a variety of federal and state courts, regulatory agencies, congressional committees, even consulted with foreign governments and international organizations. His latest book is The Political Spectrum, which is his talk tonight is roughly based on his research around that. There's copies for sale of his book in the hallway, so if you find his ideas very stimulating and want to learn more, please help him and the publisher out and pick up a copy, and you can also stick around afterwards and get it signature on it if you're into collecting book signatures like I am. So, as I mentioned, I'll pass around a clipboard with a sign-in sheet or a sign-up sheet if you want to stay in touch for our email list, and also if you're here for course credit, please remember to sign in your ID outside, and that way we can get that information to your professors so you can get credit. So that's all I'm going to say. Turn things over to our guest. Thank you.
So thank you, Professor Bennett, and it is a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me. And I'm going to pull this out of my pocket and make a reference to the sensational technological device that you're all carrying on you, and I'm going to sound just like every other boring dude that's ever pulled this out of his pocket and wanted to make an object lesson about how fantastic our technology is and how amazing to understand, and how his 9-year-old granddaughter has to explain how to program everything that goes on it. How many times have you heard that little epiphany? What, 100, 200? And you think this is another one of those talks? No, it's not. I'm telling you to put it back in your pocket and come with me a little bit to tell you what I think is really interesting. And yes, there's a lot of science to it, and a lot of engineering, and a lot of entrepreneurship, but it's a lot more fascinating than you've been led to believe. Because it's not just the march of technology. It's also some sophistication and advancement in terms of the rules, the economics, the law that has been applied to this space. And I hope you'll be impressed by this story, even though you've already noticed that I haven't been able to figure out PowerPoint technology. How about now?
Speaking of technological challenge.
The title of the book, by the way, is The Political Spectrum. The tumultuous liberation of wireless technology from Herbert Hoover to the smartphone. You'll notice my name comes up loud and clear, though. So let's talk just for a minute about this mysterious thing in space. Now, a lot of you grew up with wireless as just kind of a background amenity, so you won't be, we got reverb here? You might not be as mystified by this, but you know, wireless is long been thought to be which way does it go? Yeah, a bit of a magic trick. And in fact, Albert Einstein is quoted as saying that the telegraph is like a long cat. You pull its tail in Los Angeles and it meows in New York. Wireless is the same, but without the cat. By the way, you can Google that, and you'll think Albert Einstein did say it. He never said it, but you know, Einstein gets cited for a lot of things he didn't say. In 1930, and this is true, the Supreme Court Chief Justice, Taft, former president of the United States, said he hoped the radio got no radio cases, because he didn't want his justices to have to plunge into the law of the occult. Too difficult to understand. Well, some people thought it was quite interesting that signals went through space, and those signals could be interpreted, sent from one point to another, and actually convey information. And so about 1895, this individual, Guglielmo Marconi, decided to create a box that would actually send signals and another box to receive the signals. And sure enough, magic was born. But nothing much happened for a while because, you know, with one radio, or even two, there's not a lot of conflict. And indeed, things were quiet. Radio developed, signals were sent, signals were received. Became an issue in 1912 when there was a shipwreck. And you know about this famous shipwreck because it tragically claimed the life of a very famous American, Leonardo DiCaprio. And signals were sent from one ship to another. The closest ship had actually sent their radio operator to bed at midnight. And the closest ship to the sinking Titanic, the Californian, did not respond. The Carpathia, much farther away, got there about 8 hours later, and it was too late to do much good for about 1,500 people who lost their lives. Now, that in 1912 was the concern over radio, and the 1912 Radio Act was passed to, in fact, impose a mandate on all large ships to have a 24/7 radio operator on board. There was no real conflict between the use of the wireless space, radio spectrum as we call it, because there just wasn't enough activity. But that all changed, and when it did, something happened in the marketplace to do it. And it was identified, in fact, what developed as a market failure by people who thought it was just, you know, too tricky for private individuals, decentralized owners of the various frequencies, to actually coordinate their plans and to stay out of each other's way. And in fact, the United States Supreme Court identified this as a cacophony of competing voices. A cacophony of competing voices, and in fact misspelled by the United States Supreme Court. And so that's why I leave the misspelling in. So when you have these different transmissions, yes, they can sort of bump into each other, and the radio receivers on the other end of these transmissions that are trying to discern something useful, they can have a problem. How many radio transmissions should there be? What kind of standard should they use? How should the radio receivers go together and match the radio transmitters? That has a lot of complexity to it, and so the idea was that if you just allowed private people, without coordination and mandates from the government, to sort of go about this their own way, that they would have, well, what would they have? You know the term. They would have tragedy of the commons. I'm too lazy to get the picture of the cow, but you know what I'm talking about. How many of you have seen Tragedy of the Commons in your econ classes? And you know what it is. You say it's cows. The cows are the problem. No, the people are the problem. They're not coordinated. In fact, sometimes they'll call it prisoner's dilemma. People can't figure out how to allocate the resource to its highest valued use. Well, you know that has something to do with the ownership rules. And under the right ownership rules, people can coordinate. But maybe sometimes it's too complex to have ownership rights and to have markets actually operate. And so that was the idea here. And in fact, how did this idea get to be? I said when Marconi invented the radio, there was no problem because there was really very little conflict. And all the way for many, many years, actually, about 25 years, there was very little conflict in radio space. That situation changed when innovation hit. Remember that we're going to come into a new world here in a second, and people are going to talk about how interference from these radio stations, just kind of I try to picture that with those antennas and the transmissions. You know from the Wi-Fi signal that that's what wireless means, right? That's all that stuff is wireless. So you know that in the radio space, it's hard to see. It's invisible out there, actually, sometimes called the invisible resource. It's hard to kind of police things and know where they fit, and there's spillovers, and coordination's tough. And in fact, interference, you got to be careful. People think interference is the problem. Well, there was no interference in 1894. There was very little interference in 1910 or 1920. With good things, with innovation, interference happens. Interference forces there to be better rules. In fact, forces there to be some kind of property rights. And so this is what happens in 1920. The first broadcasting station pops into the marketplace. And what was the first radio broadcasting station? Well, by general consensus, it was Pittsburgh station KDKA. And it started broadcasting November 2nd, 1920 to do the election returns in the United States. And it was a great idea. Send out a big blast, a big emission, high-powered from a high point that goes all around and catches with one-way transmissions, catches lots of radio receivers for miles around. That was actually a different system. It was called broadcasting. Do you know where the term broadcasting comes from? Anybody have any idea where this comes from? It's not an engineering term. It's not an electronic term. Could be. Broadcasting, yeah, you got the cast. It comes from agriculture. You're not planting the seeds one at a time. You're just throwing them out there. You're broadcasting. And so the idea was that radio went from point to point, ship-to-shore radio, something like that, trying to hit a target to communicate something to some particular radio, to just sending everything out, blasting as far as you can go to as many radios as you can hit. And it's not two-way, it's one-way. It's a different kind of use of the radio waves. Fine, it's an innovation. And by the end of 1922, there are 500 of these stations broadcasting all over the United States, sending out high power, and now there's conflict. Now for the first time there's a question, who gets to use the space? Because when I set up my broadcasting station, yes, I can make it much more difficult for your radio listeners to hear your radio station. And so now the innovation, something quite positive, creates an interference that is problematic. And so this is actually how property rights come into being. You're seeing an innovation by entrepreneurs in the marketplace figuring out how to use a very quiet, sleepy technology, exciting though it may be, magic though it may appear, and doing something that is very useful. And lots of organizations, not just corporations, but lots of organizations thought this would be great, including city governments and nonprofit organizations. Universities were first and early into the broadcasting game. By the way, who would set up the first broadcasting station? How would that ever happen? There are no radio receivers. And of course, who's going to buy a radio receiver if there's no radio transmissions? Who's going to build the first radio transmitter? Who built KDKA? The pioneering broadcasting station of the world. Who do you think? Do we have any economists in here? Do we have any entrepreneurs in here? A generic entrepreneur. Who would that be? Westinghouse, absolutely. This is called vertical integration. You've heard of that, okay. So vertical integration, this is exactly where vertical integration kicks in. You're selling radios, nobody's going to buy a radio unless they have a transmitter. Okay, I'll put the transmitter in and I'll sell radios. Absolutely. So you get that kind of thing, and you also get other things like stores put them in to try to get publicity before the advertising model took over. The advertising model was just an easy way to do advertising without owning the radio station. Okay, so anyway, it's an interesting development. So innovation is giving us a conflict in rights, and what happens? There's scarcity, there's excess demand. There's now a situation where you can't have all the broadcasting you want for free because you are imposing a cost on others to blast out your radio broadcast. And guess what? It was very simple what to do. It was not difficult. You think this is tough, you think Supreme Court justices can't handle all this because it looks too occult. This was handled absolutely the correct way by this man, Herbert Hoover, a very successful engineer who gave up his private sector income at the end of World War II to famously handle the Belgian relief program to save starving Europeans after World War I, then went into the government in early 1921 to be Secretary of Commerce. And he understood the technology, and you think of him as a president, he had kind of a rough go as president. When you're president and you have something called the Great Depression hit while you're in office, that's not a good re-election plank. He's you know, people think that he was not successful. He was highly successful, one of the most successful professional engineers in American history and one of the most successful public servants. And he understood the industry, and he did exactly the right thing at the outset here. He enforced under the 1912 Radio Act, which gave the Secretary of Commerce the ability to minimize interference, but also the mandate to license those who asked for broadcasting rights. He established the simple common law rule of first come, first serve. If you're broadcasting on a particular frequency and somebody else wants to come in, they can't come in unless you agree to it. There are all kinds of time-sharing arrangements, or splits, or buyouts. In fact, licenses started trading. If there was a slot that was already taken in Chicago, that license could be sold, and the radio station would transfer with the broadcasting rights. So a market and licenses developed, but this idea that there was market failure, that markets couldn't handle it, you had a very simple enforcement rule. There was law, but under this very simple rule, broadcasting became wildly popular. 1924, called Radio Christmas. Massive national events, including sporting events, were very popular. You can see from the press that this is just standard here. You already had by 1925 Parlor Magic. I know you're embarrassed by looking at this, but this looks nice. You want to impress somebody, you show them your radio. And I love this too, because this is very contemporary, even though the Art Deco look here. And don't you like this? So their wedding night, alone at last. She's crying on the bed because he's fiddling with the radio. So, you know, what I like is the subtext here, which is, you know, we've made progress, because 100 years later, you know that he might be crying and she might be fiddling with the radio today. You with me? It's a step for gender equity, don't you think? But then it was thought that he was going to be fiddling with the radio. Anyway, so that's what it is. So this thing is just taken off. And by 1926, there are 4 million households with radios. Now, you're not impressed by that because you think of radios as little tiny chips. Well, these were big radios, and they cost about $1,700 in today's dollars. And $1,700 was a lot of money then. In fact, it's a lot of money today. You complain about spending $1,000 for your radio. Where's the one? I put it away. I said I was going to take it out. Anyway, those were very expensive radios, and 4 million households had them, and the market was going like gangbusters. So what happened? Well, Hoover's original policy was to coordinate the market. This is an annual radio conference the Commerce Department had. This is the first one, 1922, 23, 24, 25. They have them every year. And Hoover was coordinating with the industry, with the technologists, the vendors, and the public about how to have rules, first come, first served, priority in use, it was called, or right of user. There's lots of different legal terms for this. It was enforced again by the Department of Commerce. Now, Hoover adopted a new policy, and I can tell you what day he did it. July 9th, 1926, press release issued by the Department of Commerce. We have no ability to enforce any rights. Do what you want. We're out. Now, there's a whole backstory on that. We don't have time for it. Be happy to talk to you later. But the Department of Commerce decided, because Hoover wanted more authority, that it was time to stop enforcing these first-come, first-served rules. He had tried to get a bill through Congress since 1921 that would give he, as the Secretary of Commerce, the ability to decide who could broadcast. And Hoover says explicitly, as an administrative matter, we can keep these conflicts under control. What's important in a democracy is to be able to figure out who's going to broadcast to the public and what they say. And for political reasons, he wanted much more authority. Meanwhile, in 1925, the radio, the successful first commercial broadcasters, got their trade association, the National Association of Broadcasters, to ask for regulation, specifically a standard of public interest, convenience, or necessity, under which the government would decide who got to broadcast. The radio incumbents wanted to stop new entry. They wanted to stop additional competitors from coming into the market. They said, we have already established that we're giving service to the public. Let's just stop it right here. And so the incumbent political leaders, the incumbent broadcasters thought they had it figured out. Hoover wanted more demand for a law. But why? Because he's kept trying to get this law passed for more discretion. And he said, people say, why do you need a law? It seems to be working. Hoover made sure it didn't work. He backed off, stopped enforcing, welcomed everybody in. And in fact, there were about 550 stations broadcasting in July. Within a couple months, there were 750. And a lot of stations moved. Now, for the first time, there was some chaos. And there were increasing calls for the government to do something and Congress to pass a new regulatory standard. Along this way, very interestingly enough, there's a lawsuit brought by a station that is broadcasting in Chicago, and it suffers interference from another station that moves in September of 1926. And the station that was there first said, we have a private property right under common law. That case was called WGN versus Oak Leaves. And who do you think won? Well, I'll show you who won. I like this headline. So here it is. Whoop. Why is that? There we go. Okay. So, by the way, if you go back 100 years in a Chicago newspaper, you're liable to see somebody getting indicted who works for the government. And that's the top headline. Try to ignore that, although I like it. U.S. Rumnet lands Walker in Chief's Aid. So this was the liquor smuggling operation involving a municipal judge. Accused municipal judge. I don't want to prejudge. But anyway, here it is, November 18th, 1926. Court fixes radio rights on air. WGN wins. WGN was owned by the Chicago Tribune. And what does WGN stand for? World's greatest newspaper. Thank you. Wasn't a trick. These are things you have to know if you're going to be an American and take the citizenship test. I know. Okay. So, yes, world's greatest newspaper. WGN wins. Wavelength decision sets U.S. precedent. Aerial property rights defined. Now, I have to say that that's a little over the top. This was their station. They won the case. They're sort of over and impervious. One case, one state common law case, Cook County, Chicago, Illinois state law. But God bless them. This is who knows if other courts would have upheld this. Certainly there would have, been some confusion hammering this out. But there's no question that this is the way people were thinking about the law. If you got there first, and by the way, Judge Wilson, you can sort of see the name down there. Yeah, Francis Wilson wrote this opinion, and it wasn't a published opinion, but I read it. You can read it. December 10th, 1926. It was put into the Senate record by Senator C.C. Dill from the state of Washington, a Democrat who was trying to get legislation passed similar to what Hoover had asked for. And he thought it was very important to put this case in the congressional record, and he did, and that's why we have the case today. And Judge Wilson has a beautiful opinion about if you go out there and you use some valuable resource like radio spectrum and the public is getting value out of it, and then somebody encroaches on what you've done, you have an action. And the court will enforce your rights. First come, first serve. And that's what happened here. But guess what? This really, as noted by Senator Dill, who said, look, this is what's going to happen. We're going to lose to private property rights. This whole thing is going to go out to the market. We won't be able to regulate this industry. We have to act now to license broadcasting in the public interest. And so while there had been a move for regulation for a long time, a new law, more discretion, Hoover had asked for it since 1921. Now you finally had action. You had a compromise worked out between the houses, the Senate and the Congress. And sure enough, February 23, 1927, the Radio Act, and this is front page of the New York Times, the Radio Act is passed, signed by President Coolidge. And that is the law we have today. That law still stands. It governs the radio waves. 1927. What did it do? First sentence of the act, it preempts private property rights to radio frequencies. The government will decide how radio frequencies are used, not private owners. No vested rights in channels is the terminology they used. Radio spectrum allocation, radio waves go to one thing and not another. We decide the technologies, business models, and services. And we will use a public interest, convenience, or necessity standard. What does that mean? Nobody knows. Still working on it. FCC chairman, now the Federal Radio Commission was created in this 1927 act. It became 7 years later, they switched it around, same language of the law to the word, but they call it the Federal Communications Commission now, gave it additional powers. But Mother May I, FCC chairman have called it Mother May I. If you want to do something with wireless, you have to ask permission, because guess what? You can't own wireless, you can't take your own initiative in wireless, you have to get a direct authorization to do a specific thing. And that comes in the public interest and by a vote of the commission. So that's the system. That's a system of law. It does handle interference, but guess what? You stop one thing from interfering with something else, then you've interfered with that new thing. There's interference both ways. It's symmetric. And how does this system work? Well, I'll give you a couple of examples, and this hopefully will make it clear. So here's a guy I like, Columbia student. He graduates about 1912. He becomes a graduate student. They immediately make him a professor. And he becomes a lifelong professor at Columbia University. And then in the 1920s, he's got so many patents he's created. He's the largest shareholder in RCA, Radio Corporation of America. So he's done very well, and he really is one of the great inventors of this century. Here's the picture I like best, though. Here he is. He gets married in 1923, takes his wife on the honeymoon, and here's the world's first. He creates this radio. He had, he knew AM technology, did an AM radio for, and here it is. And don't you like the fact he's wearing a suit on the beach? Isn't that cool? You think it's just for the picture? I don't know. Anyway, so he had it going on. And in fact, He kept it going on, and in 1934, he created something better than AM radio, which was the craze, as we've already talked about. FM, frequency modulation, as opposed to amplitude modulation. Anyway, just technical differences, and this sounds better. It's high fidelity. It's just beautiful music. By the way, it tends to go through walls better and transmits better. Now, if you don't believe me, next time you're in a big skyscraper hotel, turn on, if there's a radio, you know, your standard over-the-air radio, tune in AM and then an FM signal and see which sounds better, okay? FM's great, okay? So he says this, the FCC has to give him permission though, because remember, it's Mother May I. And they have to make a decision in the public interest whether or not spectrum goes to that new thing. And originally, right off the bat, the FCC says, no, it doesn't work. We check with the experts. Well, who are the experts? Well, who do you think the experts were? AM radio stations. They have all experts. They said it doesn't work. Okay? So after a few years of that, they finally allowed this stuff to go on an allocation. And by 1939, they're making radios and putting in stations in the Northeast United States. 500,000 of these great radios are sold. Very expensive consoles, of course. New expensive technology, but the adopters, the 500,000 people who bought these radios, give it rave reviews. Then 1941, the war, World War II draws in the United States. 41, 42, all civilian production stops. Professor Armstrong, who had served in World War I for the United States Army, goes back in. He becomes a major in the Army. Very proud of that. Didn't call himself professor, called himself Major Armstrong late in his life. And he goes back in the Army. Actually worked with Patton's Army because they needed radios. You know, they were moving fast, and radios were great. So FM radios, in fact, they worked. They worked in World War II. But when Armstrong comes home, he finds something interesting waiting for him. Okay, that's a nice picture of his radio. And that's an FM radio in 1941. Okay, you recognize AM, 550 kilocycles to 1700. But you don't recognize this, 42 to 50. That doesn't sound familiar. You think FM is something else, don't you? You think it's what? What? 88 to 108 is correct. And there's a problem waiting for Major Armstrong when he comes home, and that is that the Federal Communications Commission, the regulator, says, no, this is a bad band for you. We don't like that. Why not? Solar flares will interfere with your service. Armstrong basically says to the FCC, are you kidding me? Who on the planet had more invested in FM than Armstrong? Well, nobody. He had taken his personal fortune to invest in FM radio stations. Of course, he had other investors and backers, and they were all apoplectic. And they had the best scientists of the day, including Armstrong himself, say this was nonsense. The FCC said, no, we've got testimony the other way. We're going to move you, like it or not. Totally appropriated, and took 42 to 50 and actually moved it to television, Channel 1. How many people watch TV Channel 1? Nobody's ever watched TV Channel 1, but it was allocated just to get rid of Armstrong. Now, people bought these expensive, wonderful machines, totally obsolete. The transmitters, totally obsolete. In fact, there was no 88 to 108 technology. Armstrong had to go back to the laboratory and create it. And by the time he got through with that, he went back to the marketplace and tried to start up a business selling radios to people. And not only wasn't he getting any buyers, he wasn't getting any backers. And in 1954, he walked out of an 11th-story apartment on the Upper East Side of New York after leaving a note for his wife, flummoxed, humiliated, and despondent over the annihilation of his baby, FM radio. If he had lived to see what would happen in the 1960s when FM radio was allowed to fairly compete with AM, he would have seen FM overtake AM within about a decade. And today, of course, you probably don't know much about AM radio, which only is used for talk and sports, because radio sounds so much better on FM. So this was what the Mother May I system tended to do to innovation. You had to prove your case, you had to overcome the incumbent resistance, you had to sometimes perform the miraculous just to get in the marketplace and compete. And sometimes even when you did that, it didn't work out too well. So this is one of the great inventors of the 20th century. And unfortunately, he is a metaphor for this top-down system where we have, in fact, a large graveyard for wireless innovation. I have an entire section of my book called Silence of the Entrants. And it goes on, technology, business model, architecture that can't get in to provide value for consumers, not because it didn't have backing in the marketplace, but because it didn't have permission in the political world. And in fact, regulators themselves have condemned what's gone on under the public interest standard. What's the most famous speech ever given by an American regulator? Ever? Alfred Kahn. That's the wrong answer, but it's an answer I would give if I didn't know what the answer was. I like it. Yeah, no, we love Fred Kahn. The most famous, as soon as I say it, you'll say, oh God, I should have thought of that. You know what the most famous speech is? This guy. May 9th, 1961, Las Vegas, National Association of Broadcasters, the chairman of the FCC, appointed by President Kennedy, Newton Minow. Newton Minow says to the assembled broadcast executives, your financial health is excellent, but your product really, really is lousy. I challenge you to sit down in front of a TV set and spend all day watching the sitcoms, the senseless cop shows, the silly westerns, the unrealistic family shows, and all those idiotic commercials. And at the end of that day, you'll know what I know. You've created a vast wasteland. The Federal Communications Commission had allocated 82 channels to over-the-air broadcast television. But then they had only given out enough licenses for 3 competitors. And the regulator was telling the industry that they had screwed up and threatening them. Because Minow said, there's a new cop on the beat. I'm the new sheriff in town. When I go back to Washington, I'm going to make sure that this waste of the precious public airwaves does not go on. And what did he threaten to do? Create new forms for the renewal of the stations. They were going to have to fill out extensive forms showing what they were doing in the public interest, showing how great their programming was. Otherwise, there was a tacit threat. They weren't going to get renewed. And those, of course, would be multi-million-dollar decisions for the TV stations. But Newton Minow did not go back to Washington and create any new forms. No new forms. What did he do? He went back to Washington, D.C. and suppressed cable television that was trying to come in and compete with broadcast TV. You think I'm making this up? Look up Carter Mountain, 1962. Stopping cable TV in Wyoming from bringing in, through microwave, video programming, and putting it on a local cable connection, sold to 10 residents in the city, on a complaint from the local broadcast licensees that the public interest would be damaged if they had to compete with cable TV content. And Newton Minow, as chairman of the FCC, voted to suppress the microwave license that allowed the cable operator to do it. And then in 1964, 65, 66, 68, there's a whole series of FCC decisions which sought to suppress cable with what they called anti-siphoning rules. Anti-siphoning, I love the term. They said that cable TV would never be the primary distribution medium for video in America. It would simply siphon off viewers and damage the viability, financial viability, of the regulated broadcast TV stations. That's protectionism. We are the regulators. We will protect the incumbent industry from all forms of competition. And they said that we have a public interest in doing, what is the public interest in protecting TV stations in 1962, 63, 64? What was the public interest? I don't have to make this up. I could read it. You can read it in the broadcast, the cable rulemakings of the Federal Communications Commission. The public interest was to make sure that those TV stations that give us news, information, and entertainment were financially healthy. The health of a democracy depends on these stations. This is when they did 15 minutes a day of news programming. 15 minutes a day for national news. And there was no 60 Minutes. No anything, no documentaries, no nothing, okay? And by the way, where does all your information come from today? I mean, from C-SPAN to CNN to everything else. All the abundance of news, non-broadcast. That's what was suppressed. Now, in this kind of non-market failure, an economist sort of chimed in about the same time. And Ronald Coase thought, you know, every great opportunity, every great wireless advance has two things about it. New opportunities for new stuff, and then potential conflicts with the old stuff. And to him, it seemed very obvious. We just have these trade-offs. We got to value the costs against the benefits. It's just like anything else in the economy. But if we have rules that incentivize people, like ownership of radio spectrum, the idea that the owners would conserve and maximize the value of the spectrum, maybe that'll work better than having disinterested regulators trying to figure out the whole system. And I'm just going to compare one situation with competitive property rights perhaps to another situation with top-down policy making from an administrative agency. So he published a paper on this, and he actually talked about having a market in radio frequencies, and the FCC, the regulators had him in to give a little testimony about this. The first question to Ronald Coase, is this all a big joke? Is this all a big joke? How can you be serious? It's too complicated for the private market. You can't possibly be serious. Well, it turns out, yeah, there's a punchline. Coase won. And not because he talked anybody into it, but the force of circumstance over the last few decades has been such that the centrally planned system, Mother May I, has had to give way. There have been little cracks at first. It took a long time. Cellular took decades to come to the market. It was actually invented at Bell Labs in 1945. Finally got into the market 84 to 89. But the new stuff is so amazing, so valuable to society, it has gotten in a way that had to force regulators to step back and to allow the market to do much more. And that liberalization has unleashed wireless. And everything we think is science, and it is science, has been made possible and in fact incentivized and rewarded and distributed and applied in subtle and amazingly effective ways by the competition for what just used to be a natural monopoly regulatory function. By having competition to choose technologies, networks, models, and all kinds of parameters for how we apply this great science. So as we sit here today, we still have the 1927 Radio Act, but we have a de facto liberalization where regulators have actually delegated to the marketplace, to licensees, the ability to use radio spectrum in ways that interfere tremendously with other applications, but which are contained in a space given to them. In other words, their property. De facto, not explicit, but effectively, this is a system of private property rights in very large swaths of the radio spectrum. And so how does that work? Well, I could say something a little bit more about Coase. I won't go there. Let's talk about a new radio inventor. Decades beyond the tragedy of Edwin Howard Armstrong. So in 2005 in Cupertino, California, there's some people thinking about how to do a better radio. And you know what happened with that. I showed you my model. They didn't have to ask permission to do that radio. Why not? Because there were parties in the marketplace that had permission to put new things, new devices, new technologies in front of the American people with what was considered their radio space, their spectrum. And those companies are called wireless carriers. And so when Steve Jobs was thinking about how to make radios amazing, he did not go to the Federal Communications Commission. Who did he go to? Who? If you were Steve Jobs in 2005, who would you talk to first? He didn't talk to AT&T first. It's a good guess, though. You have 4 choices. There are 3 more. He went to Verizon, also known as the Tiffany Network. You would have liked to have seen those discussions, and so would I. You see him? Do you see his ego? There it is. It's right up there. Can you imagine him talking to Verizon? And you know, Verizon's got an attitude too. We're the best network. That's why they call us the Tiffany Network. They couldn't work anything out. Was he paying? He has to get access for his radios. He has to get access to radio spectrum. Does he pay? Or does the network pay him? What do you think his position is? What's that? The network pays him. What do you think Verizon told him? We're the Tiffany Network. You want to fit into our network? Maybe you should pay us. So that kind of blew up. So when those talks are happening, guess who found out? Sprint. And they ran to this guy and said, we'll do it. We'll do it. What do you want? We'll do it. Can you imagine that conversation? I would not want to have been the Sprint executive who he stomped on when he told him to get the hell out of Cupertino, California. Go back to Kansas City. He didn't take Sprint seriously. He's Steve Jobs. They're not going to have their golden object on the Sprint network. So then they went to AT&T. And they had these discussions. Who paid who? Who paid who? Now, let me give you one hint. His company, Apple, is now the most valuable corporation on the planet. He actually got paid because he was making a radio that was so fantastic it would make AT&T a more popular network than Verizon. And so for a major percentage of basically AT&T's equity value, AT&T got the iPhone on an exclusive for 4 years. It's 3 or 4 years. Now, those are the old days. That was June 29th, 2007. June 29th, 2007, the iPhone debuts, and it comes out. That's fantastic. I don't know which way the payments are going to go. You know, you got to have these things play out in the marketplace. But there's a market in radio spectrum. That's what happened here. There's a market. The spectrum market is open, and he got the play. The price was negative to him. Of course, he had to build the iconic consumer device of the century to get such a good deal. And he then ended up selling, of course, iPhones to Verizon. Finally, Sprint got it. Sprint got an iPhone in 2011 or 2012, and it agreed to buy $30 billion worth of iPhones at retail prices over 4 years. That's what they had to do to get a Sprint iPhone. And at the time that deal was signed, Sprint total market value was $8 billion. Okay, so Sprint turned into a marketing tool for Apple. And it was a good deal, because they might have been gone out of business if they didn't do it. Now, the amazing thing is, innovation comes in without permission. The market deals get worked out, and what happens after? Well, you know, the rest is history here. Amazing things happen that nobody could have predicted, and all these applications interfere. The idea that the market can't coordinate this turns out to be just the reverse. The complexity of everything you have, and it's now more than 1 million apps, both in the Apple App Store and then in the competitive platform, which is Google, Android. All this stuff, everything you upload or download all the time, it's got interference written all over it. Okay, your Angry Birds, your Pandora, your Facebook, your heart monitor, your map apps, your Netflix, your movies, your Amazon, your Kindle downloads, your dog tracker, that's a dog tracker, and your cat videos. All this stuff interferes. Completely beyond the grasp of private. Are you kidding me? This is beyond the grasp of any central planner. You can't have the complexity of the marketplace without delegating to these competing networks and the vendors they deal with to try to coordinate this through pricing, through engineering, through network architecture. This is the way this stuff comes into the market. Okay? And in fact, entire new industries are born. Okay? You don't think of Uber or Lyft as a wireless business. Okay? Without the smartphone revolution, without liberalization of radio spectrum rights, there is no Uber, there is no Lyft. There are countless industries now that are built on top of this platform that only has to do with liberalization of spectrum as a prerequisite. That has to do with liberalization of spectrum as a prerequisite, not only, of course. Lots of other inputs. And even, I just want to say, even though Warren Buffett, maybe this is me poking Warren Buffett, because you know he and I have a lot in common. Since Warren Buffett bought more Apple, he's lost money. I haven't bought Apple, but I lose a lot of money. So anyway, but when I heard Warren Buffett say this on CNBC, I thought, God, that's amazing. That is exactly right. He says the most expensive real estate in the world is right here. And he also made a mistake. He said people are on these for 8 hours a day. You're trying to get it down to 8 hours a day. I know you. You're trying to get it down. Now Apple sends you little, weekly updates. You did really well. You were down to 19 hours last week. Average per day. Get your little text messages from Apple, how well you're doing? Okay. So this is the most valuable real estate in the world. I know you sleep with these. These are never far from your body. You train yourself to sleep with the ping, too. Ping, ping, ping. I know. Entirely new worlds have opened up. And guess what? This was supposed to be etheric bedlam. In a sense, it is. Nobody could figure this out if it weren't for a market. Like iPencil. Nobody knows how to make a pencil. Nobody knows how to make a marketplace or an ecosystem. Amazing complexity. So it's totally inconceivable. The public interest did not prevent the tragedy of Edward Howard Armstrong. It did quite the reverse. And it's amazing what happens today. Really, the sensational looks mundane. I mean, crime rates drop with cell phones, by the way. Drunk driving has dropped with Uber and Lyft. These are all innovations, okay? And it's nothing. It is nothing. Don't get impressed. Okay, we have these powerful computers on us right now, and they don't really, I mean, like Ray Kurzweil says, I'm living long enough to live forever. I don't know why these machines are not keeping us alive any better than they are. Okay, they have a tremendous ability to monitor your health, your medical condition, and generate big data. And they will. I have no doubt that 100 years from now, these machines will keep us in much better health for much longer than they do today, because they're fantastic, and we have to work out some of the transitional issues, even privacy issues. But there's amazingly pro-social activity going on because of these great technologies that are here because of the liberalization, because of the deregulation. And it's not, I've talked about the United States, but the story of the United States is very standard. We have led the way in technology. It's a big market, lots of innovation, and that innovation does travel very, very nicely. But many countries have worse regulatory systems. And they continue to have worse regulatory systems, but most have pretty good regulatory systems. In other words, they've gone in the direction that the United States has gone. They've gone towards allowing competitors in the marketplace to de facto own radio spectrum rights. And guess what happens? In countries you would never call free or liberal, you've got competing private wireless companies that take technology to people who really appreciate it. So I actually had the privilege a few years back of working on a couple of projects in Central America through the World Bank and the Inter-American Bank for Development. And I got to 1996, I got to Guatemala, that ended up doing an amazingly progressive, pro-competitive spectrum liberalization. I got down there, and a wonderful man, Giancarlo Barguin, I ended up becoming friends with and wrote papers with. He gave me a list, single-spaced, many, many pages long, of every city in Guatemala, population 5,000 and above, that did not have a telephone. He said, we're trying to fix that. This is 1996. They put through reforms that to this day are cutting edge for the world. I wish they'd been copied a little more. And Guatemala's done a lot of things wrong in the economy, but cell phone service in Guatemala is excellent. They immediately got 3 competing wireless competitors down there, networks, and they have no restrictions on what they can do. They adopt 3G, 4G. They're going to 5G right now. It's an amazing little experiment that they did. But countries all over the world have gone in that direction, much better than they used to. This was 10 years ago, 11 years ago, and the New York Times is talking about the cell phone ending global poverty. But you go to all over Africa, you go all over Asia, certainly South America, Central America. You're getting competing private networks using spectrum in very productive ways, not dictated by the state. That's amazing. That's amazing. And people don't really put it together. They think it's science. They think it's technology. This is liberalization. This is what open markets can do for you. Sometimes they do a lot more than that. And they do allow free speech. And we have problems with social media platforms, and we use, our technology too much sometimes. Yes, I've had teenage daughters. We've had rules. We've had issues. You get through these things. But there are a lot of first world problems that sometimes distract us from what goes on here, by the way. And that is all over the world. Free speech, economic development, linked, leveraged by these open markets that have been developed. And there is a revolution in progress. Right now, we're going to the next generation, 5th generation technology, 5G. And we're looking for spectrum everywhere. And we still have these old legacy rules in a lot of places. I mean, this liberalization I'm talking about is in particular parts of the market, but it might only be 20% of the available bandwidth. We have proof of concept. We know where it's been applied, where the liberalization has come and property rights have been afforded to competitors who use rival technologies and business models to jump to the next level. We know that that works. We know that this idea that it's too complicated for private markets and has to be dictated by mandates through administrative law is wrong. But we still fall back. Why? Because we have the 1927 rules on the books, and we have these decades-old technologies that are legacies and locked in. And so what's happening now? What's happening now is that companies are out trying to scrounge around for new bandwidth so that you can have 10x, 100x service to today. That means speeds for high-definition downloads and interactive video and all kinds. We don't even know the technologies. I like mHealth, mobile health, because I want my cell phone to save my life. But there's all sorts of stuff out there. The next ride-sharing industry that is yet to be born because of great wireless service. All of that is available. And this is something that just happened last year. We were talking about it a little earlier today. But one of the interesting things is that Intelsat has satellite frequencies. It doesn't have the frequencies. It has a license to use particular frequencies that are very valuable today, potentially for 5G, just the next generation of terrestrial, plain old cellular phone service. But they can only use them for satellite service. And so they've asked the US regulators to be able to kind of rearrange, make some more investments to help use the satellites they have now to be more efficient, not use a big chunk of spectrum and a smaller chunk to do what they're doing now, even better. But then free up some spectrum and sell it to companies like Verizon or Sprint or new operators that may come in that space. In other words, get that resource out of some old allocation and into its highest valued use. Put it where consumers can really use it and technologists can exploit the opportunities that are available today that weren't available before. So they put in this proposal in mid-2017, and it sort of sat there. And then in about April 1st of last year, not an April Fool's joke, the Federal Communications Commission made some favorable comments, and the stock soars. The stock soars. How much did it go up? Yeah, went up about 9-to-1, about $4 billion. That's just on the expectation that the regulators may allow a company to do something more productive. And by the way, that is a small fraction of total social gains. There are other companies that are actually at least as much of the band in terms of their current utilization as is Intelsat. And by the way, we know the consumer surplus, as compared to this is a present value of producer surplus, is at least 10-to-1 on average, at least 10-to-1. And by the way, this is just the hint that they'll get permission. If they actually get permission to do something more productive, it'll probably go up a lot more. So the public interest system locks them in. Liberalization that would allow this licensee to compete in the marketplace with flexibility would free them up to create innovation that the new entrepreneurs with new ways of actually providing 5G technology want them to adopt. So that is, that's an interesting idea. That's just a cell phone tower. But we know that the property rights are not too complicated for the market. They started being the logical approach to keeping order in radio broadcasting. They were abandoned for political reasons and the rent-seeking opportunities of incumbents. And now, through a long, slow, painful process, and a few visionaries, some like Edwin Howard Armstrong that unfortunately had to take the brunt of the Mother May I system, and then others like Ronald Coase, who, by the way, and this is a lesson for you in life, if people think you're an idiot and you're crazy for saying what you're saying, and you give testimony, and they say, "Are you nuts? Are you joking? Is this a joke?" If you think you're right, don't die. Hang in there. Coase lived to be 103. Excuse me, 102. I don't want to exaggerate. He lived to be 102. And by the time it was said and done, we were auctioning licenses and we had markets doing just exactly what I told you here with things like the iPhone coming in and coordinating interference through the property system. That's pretty good. Hang in there. Don't take the easy way out. See if you're right, particularly if you know you're right. And so it's a new world. We have the proof of concept. It's pretty cool. Professor Larry Summers, formerly Treasury Secretary, wasn't he chief economist of the World Bank before that? I think he was. Famous Harvard economics professor. He said a few years back, markets are able to do things that people used to think required government coordination. I found that an apt description of this process. He said markets make it possible to rent videos in every town in America with no public involvement. You kind of feel sorry for Larry getting blown away by the video rental business. But I'm with him. This is 1991 that he was quoted there. And yeah, video rentals were pretty cool at their point in time. But yeah, let's buy Larry a mobile device. He'll really, and then set him down so he doesn't get too excited. It might overheat. But this is, I'm joking about that, but it really is amazing. The things that we thought were too complicated. If you set the rules up right, if you give some practical consideration to this, and rules do come into the market that support competitive, innovative, entrepreneurial activity, it really is amazing. It is awesome what you can get. So scientific discovery, absolutely. Lots of rent-seeking. Jim Buchanan, Gordon Tullock told us about how the political process would work with economic principles. You want a system that channels that activity in the right direction, just like a system that channels scientific discovery in the right direction. And by the way, those wireless laboratories that we have today, they beat the pants off anything we had in 1980 or 1970, when in fact you couldn't get permission to do any of this stuff. Now it's open season, of course, because all these applications are paying for themselves and many times over. A lot of Hayekian spontaneity, this idea that there's dispersed information, nobody centrally knows exactly what to do, but if you allow people to sort of try out their different theories in ways that pay off or don't pay off, you might get a discovery process that beats anything else. And that's kind of what Joseph Schumpeter had to say about it when he outlined the incredible progress made by creative destruction and the market process of imagining something new and in the process destroying something old. And of course, Coase thought about it in the legal sense. Maybe property rights, defined the right way, could improve upon a government system that maybe was better than a flawed private system, but maybe was not. And just the simple idea of liberalizing markets, encouraging more competition, that's really done its work here and created economic growth and, in fact, more free speech and all kinds of media. We're not home. It's not without challenge. There's lots more to do, even in the spectrum liberalization game, where we have so much radio spectrum that's blocked from effective, full, and amazing new uses with 5G, 6G, and everything that may come beyond. So we've learned a lot, and I hope you've learned a little on this talk. Thank you. I forgot the most important part. There it is. There it is.
So we have time for a few questions. If anybody has them. If anybody has questions, raise your hand. I will bring around a microphone.
Tom, could you talk about how some of these same principles are now being played out in the related space of, sort of in the content space? So, for example, you have companies like Apple, Amazon, Google, and so forth, proposing to Congress proposing to the FCC and other agencies that, you know, AI, for example, be regulated to protect the public interest. That looks like a naked kind of cartelization grab, like what you were talking about earlier with the big broadcasters. To what extent are these same kind of battles now being fought, not so much over the use of spectrum, though they're still being fought there, but over things like what kind of content can be on social media and what information, you know, who has rights to our digital information and so forth.
Right. So, I mean, there clearly there are rules about you know, various liabilities and privacy rules and security rules and so forth, and there will be rules. And there's going to be some discussion regulation that's already, you know, a consensus of Google, Facebook, Amazon have all called for regulation of security and privacy, and you mentioned artificial intelligence, and so anyway, there will be this discussion, and you know, I mean, I can say, well, I'm nervous about, you know, look, that's just going to be a discussion, and there's going to be some move by Congress to step in. What I would say is that people should be very aware of this. Saying you're promoting the public interest is not the same as promoting the public interest. We have to be clear-headed about what works and what doesn't, and like Coase, be very empirically minded. We want to look for results. What's going to actually serve the public's interest is not just an agency that says it's serving the public interest. You want to actually be very hard-headed about this. So right now, for example, and I don't know if this is totally responsive, but it's the best I can do at the moment, and that is there is, of course, a question about privacy rules and platforms like Facebook and various breaches. And there are some ideas that would increase sanctions and penalties and increase some regulatory oversight. And in fact, there's a bill, Senator Wyden from Oregon has put forward some principles to regulate. He wants to take the opportunity to impose fines on Facebook for security breaches up to 4% of their annual revenues. And, you know, we're going to consider those. It's not for me to say, you know, consider or not consider. If there are some rules that we can put into place that really make people responsible in an efficient way and don't just wipe out whole areas of content, which can happen, and in fact already under the privacy laws put into place in May in the European Union, we have lots of content disappearing from the internet. Lots of smaller US news sites that don't have a big business in Europe have just taken their content away. The LA Times, the Chicago Tribune, 1,000 other news sites in the US refuse to invest in all the costs of compliance to, you know, and so that's a loss. Now maybe they're offsetting benefits. I think maybe the jury's still out on that, so I'm not, you know, we have to be very careful to look at all these costs and benefits. But I will say this, you think Facebook doesn't care about your privacy? They certainly want your information, and they want to sell that information to advertisers. But so do you. There are experiments now where they ask subjects, human subjects, how much would we have to pay you to go off of Facebook for a week? And from those experiments, one recent paper I read, the annual value to the average for this particular study was about $1,000 per year. You have to pay $1,000 a year to get people off of Facebook. So the value of Facebook to Facebook stockholders is a small fraction of that. A small fraction, by the way. So there's great social efficiency, great social value created. And it turns out that right now, Facebook is down about $40 billion in value from where it was when the big scandal, Cambridge Analytica privacy breach, was exposed last March. And that's adjusting for the market. In fact, it's more than 40 billion if you know, adjust it fully, because the market went down in part because of Facebook's problems. Now, Facebook was down over $100 billion at the end of last year. They actually had a very good January. And part of what was good about it is that Facebook is seen by consumers as taking some responsibility and tightening up their software and actually giving consumers better options. And so the flow of users and the use time on Facebook is seen to be bouncing back, particularly non-US users, where they have more room to grow, and they've done very, very well in Europe and other parts of the world, Facebook. But they are responsive. They're hiring lots more people who are privacy experts, and they're giving you more options. They're trying to tie it up in security. $40 billion, they're down. Now, the fine that Senator Wyden wants to put in would have gotten about a $2 billion fine. And they're just talking about it. Okay, they don't, it'd take a long time to get that stuff through. And that's on global revenues. I don't know if they could actually legally make that fly to fine on global revenues. But at any rate, the point is the market really has swift, quick, and rather severe penalties for these kinds of problems. And it doesn't necessarily take all the problems into account, but we don't want to have rules that don't support that process. We really, number one, want to support a choice process where customers get to choose, and they get to give away some data if they want to get some services in return. And secondly, that certainly firms get punished. And in fact, I'd certainly be very interested to see if people have ideas that maybe the Federal Trade Commission, which is involved in this privacy area, might be more proactive in actually having information about where the privacy breaches are, okay? And post to customers, direct to customer information. And I'll just lastly say that if you want to see where the biggest and most painful security breaches are, look to the United States government. Do you understand that in 2014, Chinese hackers got on the U.S. Personnel Office website, actually is housed on old computers, old servers at the Department of Interior because they weren't doing anything. And the files were not encrypted. And the Chinese hackers lurked for a year. And then in 2015 started sucking out personal data from 22 million current and former US government employees. I assume my own files were in there at some point. There were 4 million people who got a severe privacy loss out of this, including their Social Security number, their medical histories, and their total employment histories. Now in the hands of the Chinese government, according to US intelligence agencies. Now, I read this from a New York Times reporter, David Sanger, who wrote a very nice book about this last year, if you can call a book on this subject nice, The Perfect Weapon. The US government has never admitted this breach. It has implied it. And what did it give to those federal workers? It gave them free credit monitoring, which is useless because the reason that our intelligence officials believe it was the Chinese government, a state actor, that had this massive security theft is because it has never turned up on the black market. If the theft were by some other malicious actor, it probably would have been sold quickly because the half-life, the value declines, very quickly. And the Social Security numbers have not come out that way. But if you're in that batch, the Chinese government knows much more about you than anybody else in this market. And the government has not apologized, paid, or even informed the folks of that breach and the extent of it. These are former government workers and current government workers. And in fact, one of the top security officials actually did make a public joke, and the only direct reference about how he almost admires the Chinese government for its acumen because of all the information they got. So, look, it's not easy for the government either on these things, and the actors there operate in a system that's very difficult to negotiate, but that's the point. We all have problems with some of these issues, and just willy-nilly saying we're going to say that Facebook is not able to police itself and it's time for Congress to step in sounds a lot to me like the 1927 Radio Act. Okay, I could be wrong, but I'm not very sanguine about the government just jumping in. I want more of a discussion about what the government can contribute with new rules that are going to make things better rather than worse, because it can go the other way, obviously.
We have time maybe for one more question, and then you'll stick around for a few minutes afterwards if you want to come up and say hi. So, any other questions? And remember, if you really enjoyed this topic, you can purchase a copy of this book in the hallway.
Yeah, I guess just to kind of close out, I'm curious how optimistic or pessimistic you are about the future and the institutional rules that are going to be in place.
About radio spectrum?
Yeah.
Oh, man. Yeah, it depends on the cycle of the moon. You know, some days I'm very optimistic. There certainly is a lot of momentum in favor of pushing for more spectrum in the market. And when Intelsat, which filed its petition actually with Intel, it's not related, even though their names are similar. Intel's just a chip company. They went to the FCC and asked for, you know, permission to use more spectrum. There are a lot of players out there trying to do that, and that's great. By the way, there are a lot of players on the other side trying to stop that for rent seeking. That game goes on. But we've made so much progress, I tend to be fairly optimistic, and the world is getting this too. It's not just the U.S. We can look to other countries that have done better on liberalization than the U.S. has in some respects anyway. U.S. is a big market. We've done pretty well. Right now, we're deploying 5G, and there are no 5G licenses. It's just that the old licenses that are in place and already out there are open. And so the carriers that have those licenses can deploy new technologies. And so you can look for real estate ads now and even see some that say, Verizon Fios 5G. You can get it here. And people look for that. It's valuable. It's socially valuable. It improves the value of the house. It helps them sell the house. And everywhere, companies, innovators, and entrepreneurs that want to do something with wireless, they're incentivized to go the same path. One of the great things, I hope Intelsat makes a bundle and that other companies say, yeah, let's go rent seeking. This is very productive. We're going to go liberalize the system and do more ourselves. As I said, believe me, there are interests against that want to stop it because they can and because they might get more competition and various and sundry other reasons. But the fact is there's so much value being unleashed, and we have proof of concept on how this can happen, so that I tend to be optimistic.
Okay, so just join me in.
Thank you.